Welcome you all. This is Walter Vergara welcoming you to this webinar, which is, I'm trying to share my screen. Jaren, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Walter Vergara. I'm the coordinator of Initiative 20 by 20. I want to welcome you all to this webinar sponsored by the Initiative on Carbon Markets for Nature-Based Solutions, the Regulatory Framework. I'm happy to report that this webinar has raised a lot of interest. This is the agenda, very simple agenda. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on 20 by 20 in the background, then I'll pass it to Frances Seymour, who is a distinguished senior fellow at WRI. And she will introduce Mary Grady, and then we'll go back after her presentation to the commentaries by Juan Carlos Aybar and Juan Andres Lopez. There will be a period of questions and answers and some concluding remarks by Charlotte Streck. So the context of land use in Latin America is complex, but can be summarized with a few numbers. And the most important of which, for the purpose of this event, is the fact that land use accounts for most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the region. It's also central to the social and economic fabric of economic activities in Latin America, but we are focusing on that footprint. And this is a number that has just been concluded. It's a report that is coming in January. We estimate that in 2018, 58% of all greenhouse gas emissions from Latin America come from land use. So there is no way around it. If we want to move toward carbon neutrality in Latin America, we have to work on issues of land use. Initiative 20 by 20, of course, dwells into this area. It's an effort led by 18 countries to change the dynamics of land degradation in Latin America. We work in the countries in green. Bolivia has just joined through the Department of Santa Cruz. We work with 84 technical partners and 22 financial partners. Important to highlight that because we're talking about changing the dynamics of land degradation, we work in all windows of land use. We work on landscape management, grassland restoration, avoided deforestation, reforestation, natural and assisted, and low carbon agriculture. So if the issue is land use degradation, we have to tackle not just all the biomes, but also all the uses of land. The initiative has been quite active, quite successful, thanks to its partners. There are now 195 projects by partners to the initiative under implementation, and you have here 3 examples very quickly working on secondary forest restoration, on natural restoration, and ecological restoration on land degraded by legal mining in Colombia. Even though a lot has been achieved under 20 by 20 and its partners, much more needs to be done. And that's why at COP25 in Madrid, December of last year, the ministers in the region issued the Madrid Declaration on Land Restoration. Very lucky that Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, at the time Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, participated. He's now the CEO of the GEF. The declaration asked the initiative to move the goalpost to 50 million hectares by 2030, including 30 million hectares in the NDCs, goals for 2030, and a long-term goal to use land restoration, the changes of land use, degradation dynamics to support the decarbonization of Latin American economies. I invite you, if you haven't done it yet, to check our website, which is there, initiative20by20.org. And now let me quickly pass on the voice to Frances Seymour. I'm very happy, very delighted, in fact, to have Frances with us. She's a distinguished senior fellow at WRI. She focuses on realizing the potential of tropical forests to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. including the mobilization of RED Plus finance from public and private sources. Prior to WRI, Seymour was a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, and she served as Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, CFOR, from 2006 to 2012. So, Francis, the microphone is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Walter, and greetings to all of you from a snowy day in Washington, D.C. It's quite an honor to take part in an Initiative 20 by 20 event. And I'm delighted to join this webinar in particular for two reasons. The first reason is that the topic of this webinar, carbon markets and nature-based solutions, is very timely and important. Over the last few months, there's been a huge surge of interest and activity related to carbon markets in general, and in particular, a focus on the appropriate use of nature-based solutions in those markets. Hundreds of companies have made commitments to net zero emissions, and now they're seeking guidance on whether and how to include nature-based solutions in their strategies. And also, there's probably a dozen different initiatives underway to design the rules and define the infrastructure needed for voluntary carbon markets. For example, there's the task force led by Mark Carney that published a draft report just last month on how to regulate the voluntary carbon market. There's also the NCS Alliance, convened by the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, which is seeking consensus among companies and NGOs on nature-based solutions in particular. And new reports seem to be coming out every day from other organizations on this specific topic. There's also been activity recently in compliance markets. For example, just last month, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, approved the first two programs eligible to supply forest carbon credits for offsetting emissions from international aviation. And 2021 will surely be a big year for these issues in the run-up to climate negotiations in Glasgow, as the UK has identified nature-based solutions as one of the major themes for the conference. All this new interest is, of course, welcome. Many of us have been working on RED Plus for more than a decade, but the large-scale private sector finance expected when we started down this road has never really materialized. And the revitalized discussions of voluntary and compliance-based carbon markets provide the tantalizing promise that perhaps significant private sector finance is now within reach. And we can certainly build on all the infrastructure that's been created by our investments in RED Plus, including better monitoring technology and capacity, and consensus on the kinds of safeguards that need to be in place. But there's still lots of questions that remain unanswered. For example, how are voluntary markets supposed to sync up with the national accounting under the Paris Agreement and the targets included in nationally determined contributions, or NDCs? And specific to nature-based solutions, how will investments and accounting in RED Plus projects transition into jurisdictional scale accounting? This brings me to the second reason I'm so happy to be here today. Our keynote speaker, Mary Grady, is an expert on all of these issues and has been active in pretty much all of the various policy discussions and initiatives that I've just mentioned. She has more than 25 years of experience related to voluntary carbon markets, including a decade with the American Carbon Registry at Winrock International. She also serves on the council of the International Emissions Trading Association, or IETA. So I can think of no one better to give us an overview on this topic and respond to your questions. I have gotten to know Mary in her role as the director of a new initiative called the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions, or the ART, which has its secretariat at Winrock. Earlier this year, ART published a new jurisdictional standard for crediting forest carbon emission reductions, and it will soon be updating that standard to include crediting for removals from forest restoration. We're hopeful that this standard will help supplier jurisdictions command the higher prices for forest carbon credits that they deserve for the results of their efforts to protect and restore forests. I serve as the art board chair, so I've had an up-close view of both Mary's technical expertise as well as her strategic vision. I look forward to hearing her overview on carbon markets and nature-based solutions, and I hope she'll have a little time to talk about the art as well. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mary Grady.
Thank you very much, Frances. My goodness, what a introduction. And thank you also, Walter, for the honor of speaking today to the Global Restoration Initiative 20 by 20. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Boa tarde todo mundo. I'm really humbled to present to such an esteemed group of experts and practitioners that are doing such important work. The work that we're doing at Winrock as a secretariat for the recently launched Architecture for REDD+ Transactions, or ART, is very well aligned with your objectives. So can you go to the first slide, please? So as you're all very well aware, all studies that evaluate the pathways to limit warming to 1.5 degrees by mid-century demonstrate the critical importance of nature-based solutions to deliver near-term climate results at scale and as a low-cost option. Honestly, every time I see this graph, I'm shocked because the magnitude of the challenge is really staggering. Around a quarter of all carbon land is stored in tropical forests, but we're losing forest at alarming rates. Notably, if tropical forest loss were a country, the resulting emissions would rank just below the US and be significantly higher than the EU. According to analysis by WRI and TNC, forest, together with other natural climate solutions, can deliver 1/3 of the cost-effective mitigation results that the IPCC says are necessary by 2030. This is over 11 billion tons annually, the equivalent of halting global oil consumption. The existing systems and public funding are not sufficient. Reaching this goal will require mobilizing billions of dollars of additional annual investment from all sources, including from the private sector, to protect and restore forests. So how can we achieve this? We believe there are 3 legs on the stool that are needed to mobilize capital at scale. Next slide. The first is to focus on the opportunities that are scalable for the highest impact. While this may seem glaringly obvious to all of us, we really do need to educate buyers that in order to stabilize global average temperatures and keep on track to maintain a 1.5 degrees Celsius course, avoided and reduced emissions from deforestation of standing natural forest, in particular tropical forest, delivers the highest climate bang for the buck. In addition to the enormous biodiversity, ecosystem services, and economic benefits that standing forests provide, intact forests offer simultaneously a large-scale mitigation potential by reducing deforestation and an important global carbon sink, absorbing over a quarter of the anthropogenic carbon emissions from all sources. So protecting existing forests must be an element of any viable climate strategy. And of course, you all know this, but we must also start yesterday to aggressively pursue strategies to replant and regenerate deforested integrated lands. That's because it will take about a century for replanted or regenerated forests to store the same amount of carbon it once did before that forest was destroyed. Both of these are critical elements of a strategy to transition to net zero by mid-century, when residual emissions need to be neutralized, including by nature's own removal technologies. Next slide, please. The second leg on this stool to mobilize capital at scale is to adopt nature-based solutions into compliance carbon markets. The California carbon market, while subnational in scale, was one of the first major regulated carbon markets with rules for crediting forestry, namely avoided conversion of forest, reforestation, and improved forest management. Winrock's American Carbon Registry is an approved offset project registry for the California market and has issued over 100 million tons, or about 70% of the forestry credits that regulated entities can use to meet their compliance obligation. To give an idea of timing to reach scale, the California Air Resources Board, which is the state regulatory agency, launched the offset program in 2013. The first forestry credits were issued under the ARB Forestry Protocol in 2014. And in the past 7 years, ARB has issued over 170 million tons of forestry credits. This is to US forest projects alone. Simply put, the market demand and a price signal resulted in forestry credits at scale. Forestry reductions represent 82% of the compliance offset supply, providing climate benefits and helping to ease the cost of compliance to capped entities. It's also important to note that almost half of this volume, over 70 million tons, has been issued to 12 Native American tribes. This climate finance of close to $1 billion has provided a significant revenue stream for the tribes to invest in stewardship of their lands, to enhance wildlife, to ensure clean water, and to reduce fire threats. They've invested in local economic development opportunities, repurchased native lands and ancestral artifacts, and they've gained financial security. This is truly a model for a successful NCS market. And as Frances said in her introduction, the most recent compliance market that has approved nature-based solutions is the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which approved ART-issued jurisdictional forest carbon emission reduction credits for airlines to use for their compliance under the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or the CORSIA. This ICAO decision signals an historic milestone for protecting the forests. Credits from REDD+ have been disallowed in all major carbon markets, including the UN Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol and the EU Emissions Trading Scheme. The CORSIA is therefore the first international regulated carbon market to approve this important category of emission crediting. Airlines from 88 countries, representing close to 80% of international air traffic, have joined CORSIA's voluntary phase starting in 2021. From 2027, compliance becomes mandatory for countries with large aviation industries. The demand for offsets is forecast to be between 2.5 and 4 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through 2035. This is a significant opportunity for REDD+. And while demand from the airlines under the CORSIA has been delayed due to the COVID pandemic, the ICAO approval of greenhouse gas crediting programs and CORSIA eligible units has been interpreted as a seal of quality by market participants. Since the first crediting programs were approved earlier this year, interest in purchasing CORSIA eligible credits is increasing from corporate voluntary buyers outside of the airline industry, including from other hard to abate sectors, as a way to ensure they're investing in credible emission reductions. We welcome this surge of private sector demand for high integrity carbon credits from over 1,000 corporations that have made net zero commitments and set science-based targets. We hope ICAO's approval of ART provides the needed quality imprimatur of quality voluntary investments in REDD+. Having jurisdictional REDD+ crediting approved in a global compliance carbon market is exactly the signal that countries need to take action. Next slide, please. So the third leg of the stool to attract finance at scale is to ensure the integrity that investors need to scale capital deployment and to offer a solution to connect private buyers with forest jurisdiction suppliers of REDD+. An economic analysis by the Environmental Defense Fund found that the cost savings from international trading of emission could translate into direct gains for the atmosphere and could produce nearly double the climate ambition at the same overall cost as countries complying with the Paris Agreement targets without international markets. Results indicated that global emissions trading could reduce the total mitigation cost of meeting Paris targets by 59 to 79%. This translates to $300 to $400 billion in current value terms, with the high end of this range assuming that REDD is included in these markets. If these cost savings were reinvested into greater emission reductions, cumulative emission reductions over the 2020 through 2035 period would nearly double the emission reductions that would be achieved using only current policies. A large part of these gains comes from the inclusion of REDD credits in markets. In the global market scenario, the cost savings from REDD+ enable 54% of the total increase in ambition of 70 billion tons. The study concluded that in order for markets to reach this potential and increase climate ambition, high integrity standards and accounting rules must be deployed to ensure the environmental and social integrity of market transactions. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, that is why we created ART, to provide the confidence needed in the integrity of forest emission reductions to unlock new large-scale investments to protect and restore forests and reward countries that are delivering those results and contributing to Paris Agreement goals. Next slide. So ART is a global voluntary crediting program, or architecture, to register, verify, and issue high-quality REDD+ emission reduction credits to countries and jurisdictions. To achieve results at scale, ART has a few key design features. So first of those design features is that ART credits only at the jurisdictional level, which is the national level and large subnational jurisdictions that have at least 2.5 million hectares of forest area. This matters not only for achieving results at scale, but also because working at a jurisdictional level helps to mitigate some of the key risks inherent in REDD+, including leakage and reversals. In both cases, the larger the area, the lower the risk of leakage or the displacement of the deforestation activities, and of reversals, because a singular event, such as a fire or a pest infestation, will have a smaller impact when measured within a larger area. Jurisdictional scale crediting also provides incentives to governments in supplier jurisdictions to do what only governments can do: regulate land use, enforce the law, recognize indigenous land rights, and implement green fiscal policies in the land sector. The second key design feature of ART is that ART is a standalone program that is independent of donor or government countries and has standardized procedures for all participants. This eliminates the protracted negotiations in place of business-like transactions. Additionally, through a separate organization, the nonprofit Emergent Forest Finance Accelerator that will facilitate transaction in ART certified credits, ART offers participating countries access to a wide range of potential REDD+ investors and buyers. Emergent has formed a corporate buyers coalition that includes companies in hard-to-abate sectors such as energy and transportation that have made commitments to invest in nature-based solutions, and companies that have made corporate and supply chain emission pledges. The third design feature is that while ART could be used as an Article 6.2 trading mechanism between countries, ART is specifically designed to attract private capital. Private capital flows through markets, and markets need standardization so that REDD credits are comparable among jurisdictions and fungible with emission reductions from other sectors. In order to attract private capital at scale, market participants need to have confidence in the integrity of the results, and that's what we aim to provide. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I should have had that one changed sooner. Next one, please. So ART's standard for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification is called the REDD+ Environmental Excellence Standard, or TREES. TREES reflects a decade of learning and evolution of REDD+. TREES builds on the significant bilateral and multilateral investments in REDD that have helped to transition REDD to a jurisdictional scale focus, to build capacity in forest countries, and to test approaches for quantification and monitoring. As we were developing ART, we consciously built on this base of experience to create a crediting program that is Paris aligned and incorporates market elements that provide confidence in results, such as standardized and conservative baselines, accounting requirements that enhance ambition over time, mitigation of leakage and reversal risks, Cancun-aligned safeguards, independent verification, avoidance of double counting, and the issuance and tracking of serialized credits on a transparent registry. These requirements allow for TREES credits to be fungible in markets with credits from other sectors and to attract finance at the scale needed to protect and restore forests globally. The advantage this offers to supplier countries is clear expectations and requirements for crediting under trees and the ability to access markets such as ICAO and private capital. The advantage this offers to buyers is that given the rigor and standardization of trees, environmental and social safeguards requirements, they can be assured of the integrity of the results. Next slide. So we're currently updating trees to version 2.0 to include approaches for crediting of removals. So this would include reforestation efforts, and to reward high forest, low deforestation countries for their low levels of deforestation. We're also making clarifications and developing guidance for elements that were not clear in the first version of trees, such as allowable monitoring systems, requirements and procedures for calculating uncertainty, methods for quantifying degradation, and mapping tree safeguards requirements to countries' UNFCCC safeguard information systems. We also plan to make it very clear that while trees does not directly credit project level activities, we're not against RED projects. Project scale investments are absolutely necessary, but on their own, they will not be sufficient to turn the tide on the current levels of forest loss. Project scale initiatives must be nested in jurisdictional scale programs and accounting to avoid double counting and for effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. ART does not intend to prescribe the way that governments work with the private sector, rather offers flexibility for any number of approaches as best suited to individual country situations for nesting projects or benefit allocation agreements. In fact, we're developing a paper for participating countries and jurisdictions on options for attracting private sector investments to help with the implementation of jurisdictional RED Plus strategies. And that paper will be published early next year. Trees 2.0, which will include these updates, will be open for stakeholder consultation in early 2021. We look forward to feedback from market participants, including all of you, and we welcome the first ART participant jurisdictions and transactions in the run-up to COP in Glasgow next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. That was very interesting, and thank you to Francis as well. We have already a number of comments, so I'll remind everybody that you can include your questions in the questions and answer label in the website. I also, before we go into the commentary, I also want to welcome the presence of Minister Oquist from Nicaragua, who has been an example of interest and action in this field. So many thanks for joining, Minister Oquist. Right now, what we want to do is to go to two independent commentaries. And the first one will be provided, brief commentaries, 5 minutes. The first one will be provided by Juan Andrés Lopez Silva. He's the manager and founder of Carbo Sostenible. He's a founding member of Azocarbono, RED Plus, advisor to Colombia's National Park Service. Juan Andrés has also been part of the World Bank team. In fact, we worked together 20 years ago, which shows either how old we are or how current these issues still are. But he comes with the right credentials to offer an independent comment on the presentation by Mary and Francis. Juan Andrés, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Walter. Here I am. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this excellent presentation. It's very interesting, and to be clear on how or what I represent. I'm working with Azocarbono, which is the Association of Developers of Carbon projects in Colombia, and I'm also advising currently the National Park Service, where we've been having this discussion about the private sector participation, the project's level participation versus the jurisdiction. And here, and I heard your last comments, Mary, and thank you very much. It is good to know that this is open to discussions. This is standard, but the first thing that strikes is how this is, as you placed it, directed to the countries or country level and jurisdiction level, and it is aimed to be applied to entire country. And then, of course, it comes the question on how you nest the projects, both the ones that are already working or being implemented, and the ones that are being prepared. And Colombia is a good example because the demand is very, very vibrant and large. And in fact, there are, I mean, the number of tons that are available to compensate for the carbon tax in Colombia is just a third of what is needed. And so when we're talking about, I don't know, a potential demand of total is 60 million tons a year, and assuming that it is impossible to compensate all those emissions because the carbon tax is paid by everyone, including the very small users of fuel. So let's take aside 20 million, and then you end up with 40 million tons demand per year, which is a very solid demand. And then, of course, that has given rise to this increasing participation of private sector in Colombia, and you can find everybody here. And as you probably know, the big red project developers are all here. They have opened offices. The Colombians have also increased in numbers as project developers, and so there are many efforts today trying to get projects on the ground and having them validated and verified. So this is a practical challenge we have already to try to nest all these projects which are in the making and being implemented with a potential jurisdictional standards or approach. And the issue here is the readiness, because as you know, the deforestation in Colombia in the border of the Amazonian region is really getting larger and larger. It has tripled in the last 3-4 years in that area, if not more. Sometimes you get 10 times the deforestation, even in the national parks. So there is an issue of urgency, and the private sector resources are ready to deploy under projects. No, so there's this issue of how you can accommodate, or you should accommodate, these players in the short term to get the results on the ground very quickly. And before you get to this, I think they are very good. I mean, theoretically speaking, and I think the objective is probably very good to have a jurisdictional, and you'll probably need that at the end, because as you have many projects crowding out the areas, you will probably start to see some conflicts, but probably that won't happen before, I don't know, 5-10 years down the road. So in this short term, how can you tackle with these deforestation issues? And the last point I want to make, Walter, I'm going to finish with this, is on the safeguards, because one, I mean, everybody's claiming to be compliant with the safeguards and the Cancun safeguards, but the main safeguard is the consultation with the interested groups. And in the Amazonian region, as you know, there are very large pieces of land in Colombia. If you're not an indigenous people, you are a national park if you're in the Amazonian. I mean, what is left is really a minor and in area. So you need these indigenous groups to be really consulted in anticipation, and these This is easier if you do it project by project, because very costly for a government to try to involve all these communities which are very far apart in remote areas, but the private sector through the projects can really get to them, and that's how all these projects have been evolving in the recent years. I'm going to stop there. Those are challenging questions or comments or reasonings about it, but thank you very much, Walter.
Well, Andres, very interesting, your comments, very useful. We'll have some time to discuss them, but let me turn very quickly to Juan Carlos Gonzalez Aybar. Juan Carlos is a founding member and team member and director for Latin America was of the Altilia Climate Fund. Today, Juan Carlos is a senior project manager for nature-based solution business, a unit of Total. He lives in UK and France and is a carbon finance specialist by training. Juan Carlos, while he was at Altilia, played a major role in Initiative 20 by 20, and we hope that he will continue to offer his practical insights to this adventure we have in Latin America. Juan Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Walter, and everyone to be here. I will speak from my perspective as I would say a citizen, a personal professional, and also with my hat as an investor. So thank you, Mari, for the very interesting presentation. I have been having discussions with the colleagues and friends of the Environmental Defense Fund in the US and with Aaron from Emergent, and we follow all this initiative and we will be supporting it as much as we can with our ideas and with hopefully also with our financial support, right? If I can say two words about what the ambition that we have and how this can actually match of what has been presented, or what I can comment on what Mari present, is that as a Total Group is transitioning, of course, from a major oil company to a major multi-energy company, and therefore we have budgeted $100 million per year from this year on nature-based solutions, on investments, meaning in order to actually finance capture of carbon by natural ecosystems. And that doesn't mean that we will buy carbon credits. I mean that we will be, as an investor, supporting people on the ground to actually achieve this performance, to achieve the emission reductions. So the last things that actually everything, and the fact that art will also consider, which is what Mary said, actually supporting existing activities, existing projects in order to be nested within the jurisdiction. I mean, this is actually things that could happen. I want to say that the deforestation is a poverty problem, right? I come from Peru. I know quite well Latin America. I have traveled across the subcontinent, and deforestation is a poverty problem. And there are two major points in Peru, which was a very poor country 30 years ago, to the country where it's today, that's still poor, but have improved a lot. One is in the 1990s. In the 90s years, we actually changed our constitution to put the role of the state not as an investor or as controlling the economy, but actually allowing the private sector to play. So the subsidiary role of the state. And at that time we had 70% of poverty, right? And then it changed. And the other is the free trade agreement we signed with the United States in 2000, that entered into act in 2009. So with these moments, we decreased from 70% to 20% of poverty in the country. And that was, of course, within a framework that was proposed by the state, but actually allowing people to trade, to invest, to develop their activities. So we, as an investor, we want to support the jurisdictions, of course, but we are not policymakers and we are not politicians. We are a company that was used to do energy projects, but now we are also doing nature-based solutions projects. So we our perspective is that in this framework, in this architecture that is being constructed by art, it's very important that there's a big play for activities in order to flourish. At least in my country, you know, even in good times before COVID, it was very difficult for us to get in order with, you know, poverty, corruption, informality, and that is in Lima. Imagine in the Amazon region, which is very far away. And now with COVID, of course, the situation is more complex. So I mean, the states are fragile. This is why it's very important that whatever architecture is built, that the doers are empowered. So we don't kill the private initiative. And I don't mean private initiative like people like Total. I mean private initiative, people like Juan Andres that develops projects on the ground. And he is a biodiversity and conservation entrepreneur. So I think it's very, very important that we empower the conservation entrepreneurs, like biodiversity entrepreneurs, to actually keep doing good things, because it's a new economy, which is actually happening. It's not a carbon trading market. I think that a market of the carbon market, of course, is something that's been structured, but it's a major trend. It's a major economy. It's another world that's is under construction. This is actually what Total understood. This is why we're investing such much money in energy transition, and we're also having a new activity in nature-based solutions, because the world of today is already different to the world 5 years ago, and it's completely different to the world in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So I think it is very, very important in whatever action we do as a think tank, World Resource Institute, Windrock proposing architectures, we as an investor and operator, that we promote the private initiative. So this is, I would say, Walter, I'm very happy about this architecture for retransaction that is considering the nesting of projects. This is very, very important. We won't invest in jurisdiction. We invest in activities for planting trees, for avoiding deforestation, creating value chains. And this is actually our mandate, is what we enjoy.
Excellent, Juan Carlos. Many, many thanks for your insights. Also to Juan Andres. We have received a number of comments and suggestions, and some have been answered by Mary already directly. I would like to allow Mary now to respond to the comments raised by Juan Andres. Trying between amongst those comments is the issue of timing. And I am also witness to the great demand, the great emphasis by individual entrepreneurs trying to develop projects. And how do you handle this issue of timing? Are we going to wait for the full architecture to be in place? And what is the impact on individual projects today? Why don't we start with that? But please feel free to address any of the questions or comments raised by Juan Andres and Juan Carlos.
Sure. Well, I guess starting with that one, as I noted, art is very flexible, because what we realize is that different countries have different situations with respect to projects. And so though we need to allow the flexibility for countries to work those out directly with the project developers, work out how either the projects will be nested in an accounting framework and aligned with the jurisdictional scale accounting, or they might be arrangements for benefit sharing or other types of arrangements. And so we're very flexible on how this might work, and we'll be developing an options paper that we'll put out next year. With regard to current thinking, we have talked with a number of countries that do have projects, such as Peru, and Peru is actually looking at an allocation method to figure out which portion or ratio, if the government were to get credits, how they would allocate those credits at the national level down to the project level. So, you know, the project level investments are really critical, but it's also critical for climate results, for everything to be rolled up into larger scale national accounting, in particular to make sure that we're aligning with the Paris Agreement and avoiding double counting.
Okay, Mary. One question related to that is how will countries that implement art deal with the existing portfolio of initiatives? There are already projects on the ground. There are already projects that are working with the volunteer market. How do you incorporate that into this global or national architecture?
Well, like I said, we're not going to credit projects directly, but we understand that projects exist on the ground and we want to see those projects continue, but they really have to be incorporated into that framework. So art is also open to subnational crediting. So governments, obviously we would like governments to transition to full national level accounting, but if there are a subnational jurisdiction perhaps that doesn't have any projects, could start by entering art while the nesting arrangements or other allocation arrangements are being incorporated for other jurisdictions. We also are aware that this is not an issue for all countries and jurisdictions. There are a number of countries and jurisdictions that we're speaking with now that don't have any projects. So it's not necessarily a situation for all, but where there is a situation, we're happy to talk with the governments and the projects to work out an amenable solution. But it really is going to be a negotiation, I think, between those project investments and the jurisdiction that's applying to art.
Do you see an issue of momentum or of delayed momentum linked to the announcement of a forthcoming architecture and the current driving forces, the current eagerness of the private sector to get into the field?
We've actually seen a lot of interest from the private sector in investing in jurisdictional scale credits. I think some of the risks from the buyer perspective in terms of reversals and leakage and other risks like that, and including environmental and social safeguards, are really better addressed at the jurisdictional scale. There has been significant experience also with through the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, looking at carbon accounting and dealing with a lot of the issues, including how to nest or allocate with projects. So I think there's a lot of interest. Everybody knows this is a direction that we're heading in to be Paris aligned. And so it's just a question of how do we operate in this transition period.
Okay. In the Amazon basin, there are large countries and smaller countries. Guyanas, Ecuador is smaller than Colombia, Peru, Brazil, in the share of the basin. Does art be able to work with smaller countries and provide the efficiencies that are being demanded by the private sector?
Yes, so in terms of scale, I did want to clarify that the scale eligibility threshold is for subnational participation. So if a subnational government wants to participate, the scale threshold is 2.5 million hectares of forest area. But there is no scale threshold for national governments. So if a country that's smaller than that wanted to come into art at the with national accounting, full national accounting, there is no restriction on that. So all countries are welcome to apply at the national level. And of course, we're welcoming all countries to come into art. And we have the good luck to be partnering with UN Red as a delivery partner. And UN Red has already been speaking with a number of countries and subnational jurisdictions to assess their readiness, to look at gaps, and then to help figure out what areas they might need capacity building and technical assistance in order to be able to come into the program.
Thank you. Can you provide specific country examples of successful pathways, concrete financial mechanisms that have already reached consensus that can be used to advocate the architecture in the near future?
Well, as Francis noted in the beginning, we published the standard in February. weeks before we entered into a global pandemic. So we haven't had any countries yet that have gone through the process of applying, having their credits verified and issued, having a transaction completed, and being able to demonstrate what that looks like. But we do know that there are countries that have had that level of success in bilateral agreements that have been able to significantly reduce emissions and be able to attract finance for those achievements at a large scale. So we're hoping to build on that with ART. And what we're really trying to do is build on those successful efforts from the past and all the learning that's happened, and be able now to do something that's market ready so that we can attract private sector finance, in particular through markets.
Thank you, Mary. We're running out of time and we keep receiving questions. Jaren, please take a note of all the questions. We'd like to answer them afterwards if we don't touch them during the session. A comment from David Antonioli, who you probably know well. Vergara has developed a jurisdictional framework that sets out clear requirements for how to nest projects into a jurisdictional program. It's called Jurisdictional and Nested RED+. David believes that projects can play a key role and need to be supported, and that's an example of how to do it. Any comments on that, Mary?
Yeah, I think that the work that they have done, that Vergara has done in figuring out how to incorporate requirements for nesting projects is to be congratulated. And like I said, we're going to be coming out also with some options that, because we think there are options that are beyond just accounting options for nesting projects.
Okay, a very specific question, your example on Corsia. The question is, does Corsia require that airlines demonstrate that they are reducing their emissions beyond buying carbon credits in order to participate in the program?
So Corsia is set up as a program for carbon neutral growth starting in 2020. There has been an adjustment of the way that the baseline has been set due to COVID and the lack of air travel this year. Airlines are required to measure and report and reduce their emissions, and then they are required to compensate for that baseline, anything that they have that's above that 2020 baseline.
Okay. As I mentioned, there are many questions and they keep coming. Jaren is making a permanent record so we can answer them. I promised Charlotte enough time for her concluding remarks. Why don't we go into that? And if there are a few minutes left afterwards, we can come back to the discussion. Charlotte, please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. And I made, took a lot of notes here. Let me summarize this rich discussion and maybe, offer some suggestions, conclusions. So it's very important. And I think probably the most important takeaway is that we need to act, and we need to act now. To meet the Paris climate goals, the nature-based solutions provide about a third of the solution, and we don't have a lot of time. We need to stop deforestation as soon as possible and massively invest in forest restoration. So far, success has not been great. So I'm publishing annual updates on the New York Declaration on Forest, which included the goal of halting natural forest loss by 2020. And we all see that we are passing this, or this deadline is passing by now. And deforestation, in particular the loss of primary forest, has increased in the years since the adoption of the New York Declaration. So it's absolutely essential. We need a suite of policy solutions. Carbon markets are providing a very important part of it, but of course they are also not a silver bullet. I think that's also important to say, because we have issues of enforcement and illegality, and we need to address mining, infrastructure development, agricultural supply chains, strengthening forest governance, confirming land titles, strengthening land titles, addressing poverty, what has been mentioned, and strengthening the right of indigenous peoples as guardians of the forest. Now, carbon markets are certainly an important piece, of the suite of policy solutions. And here we see carbon markets offer different solutions and different phases and different instruments for different deforestation situations and for different countries. Let's say the different phases include that there are some countries, that are ready to access jurisdictional carbon markets and may apply art trees, the architecture art trees, relatively quickly. Certainly that would involve the countries that have stronger governance and are generally the wealthier and stronger developing countries. However, there we also, and that comes to good different solutions, and countries need to see, how to deal with this. Of course, these are also countries that normally have strong private sector governance in the forest sector and need to consider how to include, a recognition of private sector rights within a national system. So the national system, if only the government sells carbon credits, which may be the desired solutions, of course, then internally, and I'm a lawyer, as many of you know, internally there needs to be a compensation for the taking of these rights of the private entities or the communities that own these rights. And in this context, as Mary has mentioned, for the California system, where the indigenous communities have been allowed to develop carbon projects and supply credits into the Californian market, this has certainly empowered them and strengthened their rights. So that's, the right-based approach within, the national policy solution is certainly important. Now, other countries have already engaged and have made great progress in setting up national systems, because of course we all agree, the governments should absolutely essential for for sustainable forest or land use and forest governance in the medium and long term. But and many countries have already invested in the FCPF. They have received support from UN-RED, and are ready to access results-based finance and potentially then carbon market finance. So there is also certainly, a graduation from what the FCPF has done towards now R3s, which is stricter in the requirements to access carbon markets. So the result-based payments that countries so far have applied for is often not meeting the compliance criteria for a market. These countries, the red countries, need to deal with the issues, that have been mentioned, how to nest projects, how to recognize, again, the rights of those that are in the country and hold carbon rights, hold land title rights. Again, with, this is the rights issues less prominent in countries where the government has rights to all, to all forest resources and ecosystem services. But I think in the region in Latin America, this is the case only in Ecuador, where there is on the constitutional level, it says that this is owned by the government. But there the nesting comes into the play, and I'm sure our trees will find a solution, and Vera has already a solution on how to recognize these projects. In the case of Vera, with allowing direct crediting and selling of these credits. In the case of art, centralizing it via the government. Good, I see now Walter looking very seriously at me, so I'm already, so I have here, yeah, but I think that is the main points, which I have noted here.
Thank you, Charles. and you in terms of timing. Thanks everybody. This has been a very interesting discussion.